Hello and welcome back to another episode of Thoughts Per Episode Classic Doctor Who Edition. Today we will be talking about the serial The Chase, which is Ian and Barbara's final serial, which is very sad, and we will talk more about that later. If it has been a few decades since you watched The Chase, allow me to give you a swift recap, surely forgetting bits here and there, because after all, isn't that what you come to these videos for? Professionalism. At the end of the previous serial, it was revealed that the Daleks have a time machine of their own and have been tracking the TARDIS crew and will now be pursuing them. This particular serial is the first since the Keys of Marinus to be more of like a multi-part adventure in terms of environment and scene, I guess. Basically, the TARDIS crew get chased across time and space, and first of all they land on a planet, a desert planet with a bunch of fish people, and we learn a little bit about them. The desert planet is named Iridia, and the fish people are the Iridians, and long story short, they get coerced by the Daleks into taking the TARDIS crew prisoner, but the TARDIS crew escape. Don't worry, if you're new here, I do go back and go over these in more detail later. In the next episode, the TARDIS makes two stops, once in New York, 1 year in the future from when it was filmed, and the next on a ship in the middle of the ocean, which is apparently famous, but I don't know about it. Both times they meet the locals, have a bit of a interaction with them, leave, and then the Daleks turn up and scare the shit out of the locals pretty much. Then the TARDIS lands in a haunted house, which may or may not have actual supernatural consequences to it. Then finally, where I would say the bulk of the story takes place, the TARDIS lands on the planet Mechanus with the mechanoids, except first of all we meet is these fungal mushroom-like plants around the place which sometimes randomly try and eat people standing near them. While escaping the Daleks, they find the city that the mechanoids built, and then they kind of get taken prisoner by the mechanoids who treat them like animals in a zoo, where they meet Stephen, and then they escape. Stephen apparently dies, except of course he doesn't because he's the next companion. At some point the Doctor makes a bomb which he sets off, which kills all the Daleks, and then Barbara and Ian use the Daleks' time-traveling machine to get back to their home, because the whole reason that they couldn't go home in the first place was because the TARDIS is a little bit undercooked at the minute and doesn't know how to actually set coordinates, so they used the Daleks' time machine to get home, and that was the serial. It's not really an easy one to sum up quickly, if I'm being entirely honest, but yeah, overall I really enjoyed this serial. The Daleks are always fun in classic Doctor Who, and I thought that the concept of the TARDIS skipping around and landing in all these different locations really helped the pacing, because I think in terms of modern sensibilities, perhaps, a lot of classic Doctor Who serials suffer from massive pacing issues. Now, I did notice that this particular serial was written by Terry Nation, who has done the other two prominent Dalek serials, so I guess the Daleks are very much a Terry Nation invention, and I feel like it's always a good serial when Terry Nation writes it, which is pretty fun. I also noticed, checking the wiki just now, that he also wrote The Keys of Marinus, which I recently mentioned as the other Doctor Who serial, which is a little bit more hopping around different places. So if you've got the two core concepts, like the Daleks and hopping around different areas, instead of just sticking to one place, I feel like Terry Nation really took his two main concepts and slammed them together in this episode, in his serial. Damn it, I was doing so well. Now, let's go through my notes for a little bit more detail on my thoughts on each episode. So near the start of The Executioners, Ian is reading a book called Monsters from Outer Space. Vicky asks him if it's any good, and he says, oh, it's a bit far-fetched. I feel like this was a nod to, people talking about Doctor Who back in the day. I feel like this is very much a conversation that could have happened with people talking about Doctor Who. Oh, I've been watching Doctor Who on telly lately. Oh, is it any good? It's a bit far-fetched. This first episode had a lot of interior TARDIS scenes, and I bloody love interior TARDIS scenes. I feel like we don't get enough of them. I'm sure we probably get more of them in Classic Who than we do in Modern Who, but I always want more of them in Modern Who. I get why we don't get more of them. The show is very much supposed to be about going out and adventuring through time and space, not hanging out at home, but the TARDIS is an inherently fascinating and cozy concept, and I just wish we spent a bit more time in there, like figuring out what it looks like on the inside, what life looks like inside the TARDIS. I like that the Doctor is very busy trying to fix an unfortunate juxtaposition of the sonic rectifier. That's some good sci-fi babble. Oh, the Time TV. The Time TV was introduced in this serial. I have no idea how long this is going to remain a thing, but basically, I think the thing that the Doctor hauled in at the end of a previous serial was this. And the idea is that instead of adventuring through time and space, you can instead plug in this massive machine with a tiny screen and watch things happen as they happened throughout history. The Doctor basically mentions some science that we haven't discovered about light, like being able to capture like photons which have held like the images of these times, but they never explain how they get the sound, do they? They actually dedicate quite a lot of time to the Time TV in this episode. We see Abraham Lincoln and we see Shakespeare. It is a neat concept, but I've got to admit I don't love it because it takes what's so cool about Doctor Who, which is adventuring through time and space and seeing these events for yourself and becoming part of these events, and it turns it into just something you can watch on TV. And, I know that's, it's not going to be the case that they're just going to sit around watching TV all day. I know that's not how this show works. But just as a concept, I think it's kind of cool, but I would prefer a time machine and adventures in the time machine. Planet Iridia, where they first land, is described as a planet with high gravity and 2 hot suns with short day-night cycles. And I like this, because I feel like nowadays in modern Doctor Who, we never explore the idea of these planets, having different atmospheric compositions, having different gravity, having different orbits. It's all just kind of assumed to be breathable, relatable worlds. And I think that's kind of a shame. Like, you can tell that science fiction is perhaps a little bit newer of a genre, or at least science fiction as we recognise it is a bit more new of a genre at this point in time in Doctor Who's history, because more thought is given to the actual ins and outs of space exploration. The Doctor gives Ian a TARDIS tracker in order to find his way back to the TARDIS, and this is one of those things where I'm like, oh no, they've just solved a problem that has been a problem in the past and will continue to be a problem in the future. Don't introduce this if you're not going to keep up with it. It also made me wonder, why no walkie-talkies? They split up and get into trouble so often. You think they would just take walkie-talkies now. My headcanon explanation for this kind of thing is that maybe the Doctor doesn't want futuristic technology getting into the hands of a primitive civilization because it might warp their history, But it's never actually stated. That's just my personal little cover-up of why it makes sense. And of course, as we see through the course of this episode, it doesn't actually help in the long scheme of things anyway, so maybe the Doctor just goes, well, that didn't help, I'm never doing that again. At one point, Ian and Vicky find something which I should have written down, and remark that at least it's not a pool of acid. So clearly my comment on the previous serial about pools of acid being a surprisingly common appearance in this show is also a bit of meta commentary here. Yeah, this episode was surprisingly domestic. Like, we got a lot of time with the TARDIS crew just having fun with each other and like hanging out during downtime. Like, you see the Doctor and Barbara basically sunbathing as well. It's really cute. I really enjoyed it. But I also now think, looking forwards, it's probably a product of them realizing that it's their final serial and that they kind of want to make it a little bit more sad that they're leaving at the end, so they show like them having these little moments of humanity between them. My next note is just this. TARDIS, 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 TARDIS.
Doctor, he said the TARDIS.
For more context there, Ian and Barbara were spying on the Daleks using the Time TV. In the previous Thoughts On, I did speculate a little bit about where canonically these Daleks would be coming from. They do seem to be coming from after the Doctor thwarted them in the previous Dalek serial, the Dalek Invasion of Earth. One thing I noticed is that the Daleks' time machine is bigger on the inside too, which leads me to wonder, because later on in New Who, bigger on the inside is something that's specified to be Time Lord technology. So is this a TARDIS that they've stolen from Time Lords? Again, Time Lords have yet to be mentioned within the canon of Doctor Who. I'm not really expecting Time Lords as a concept to show up until Patrick Troughton appears. If I remember right, the Doctor has made allusions to his world and his people, so I think it's supposed to be the case that, like, he's not meant to be human, but still. Either way, I wouldn't be surprised if at some point, if his story is ever mentioned again in later episodes, if it's kind of like retrofitted to be like the Daleks stole time travel technology from the Time Lords and stole some of their TARDISes or something. The Doctor pulls out a hat, which is a lot like Five's hat, which makes me wonder, was there some kind of cross-Doctor story between them at some point, and he got inspired, or he stole his hat or something? Because timey-wimey, Five doesn't exist yet, but that's his hat. It's not his hat, but it's very similar. And of course, the Doctor and Barbara inevitably lose the TARDIS in a sandstorm. Oh well, at least they have that thing that they can do to track the TARDIS down. Oh wait, you gave it to Ian and Ian's wandered off. Oh, and also Ian has been captured by this weird Maya creature. The next episode, quite dramatically, is named The Death of Time. One thing I noted is that it's not really meant to be a story point, but the Daleks definitely do not move well on sand. We finally meet the Iridians of Iridia, the fish people on a world that's all dried up. I always like glimpses of the Doctor's selflessness, because in the William Hartnell incarnation, especially in the first few episodes, the Doctor can come across as very grumpy and very selfish, but of course he does grow to be the Doctor that we recognise, and I always love recognising him. So I really love his concern for the Iridian people in regards to the Daleks following them and attacking the Iridians, which does inevitably happen. Oh, side note, because I'm absolutely going to forget, but I'm a massive Ratchet and Clank fan, and I can't help but notice that one of the first planets we ever go to in Ratchet and Clank is called Iridia, and I wonder if that's meant to be a reference to this planet, or if it's just a subconscious kind of like, writers always accidentally name things after other things by accident, or if it just happens to be a shared name with no connection. One thing I noticed is when Barbara and the Doctor are taken prisoner, they're given food and the Doctor is happily eating it, and Barbara says, "How can you eat at a time like this?" And if that sounds like a trope to you, that is also what I thought. But then I thought, this is 1965. Is this maybe not a trope yet? But Barbara is of course upset because she thinks Ian is dead. And Vicky, she doesn't just care about Ian. I don't know why I keep leaving Vicky out of this. I'm not going to linger on this episode for too long because we do have a lot to get through, but inevitably one of those Maya monsters breaks through to the Iridian city and the Doctor and Barbara use that moment to escape, but the sequence of events is really weird. I went back and rewatched it a few times, and what I have written down is that the Maya breaking through the wall was weird because Barbara is near the wall which crumbles around her. Iridians try to pull her free. Doctor throws them off her and runs to the stairs, then sees Barbara trying to save an Iridian and returns to pull her away. So the Doctor basically, despite his earlier compassion, just throws these fish people to the giant fish tentacle monster and runs away. Again, I rewatched it a few times just to be sure, but that is pretty much what happens. I don't know if that was scripted or if that was just a quirk of physical acting with everything that was going on. But, the Doctor has been known to maybe put his companions' lives as a higher priority to other people's at times. Oh, by the way, Ian was knocked unconscious and Vicky escaped, and then she led the Doctor and Barbara back to Ian. There you go. Now you remember the entire sequence of events. This is a really interesting video commentary. Ian then wakes up and makes a trap for the Daleks out of Barbara's cardigan and the Doctor's coat. I like that when Ian asks for Barbara's cardigan, she's like, "Oh, not again." The subsequent shot of a Dalek falling in a hole was very silly. It's always funny when a Dalek falls down, isn't it? And then they escape in a TARDIS. And then I jumped to the next episode, which was surely Journey into Terror, right? Right? That was the next episode of the serial? No, it was not. It was Flight Through Eternity. But I somehow missed that episode initially and ended up having to go back and watch it later. Listen, BBC iPlayer is not the best at showing you what episodes you have and have not seen, what episodes are next in the order. Sometimes it can fuck around. But interestingly, if I was ever going to miss an episode in the middle of a serial of Doctor Who, that was the one to miss, because actually, as it turns out, The Death of Time flows almost seamlessly into Journey into Terror, and it feels like nothing is missed out. The only thing I missed out was the Doctor beginning to make his bomb. But I did go back and watch Flight Through Eternity, don't worry, and that is the episode where they go to New York, first of all. I did notice that the Doctor claims that he constructed this TARDIS himself, which of course contradicts current law that he stole it. However, the Doctor does lie. However, it could also be true that he had a job making TARDISes, and that he happened to steal one that he built. But somehow I doubt that's the case. But then again, he is pretty handy in terms of engineering when it comes to fixing up the TARDIS over the years. So maybe, but I feel like there's probably some pre-established law which would contradict that as well, and I just don't know about. But it's a fun fan theory at this moment. But it just makes far more sense that if he is on the run, if he is this renegade Time Lord who has stolen a TARDIS and run away, that he would be lying to people about where he got it from. There's one really funny moment where a Dalek goes to make some calculation noises.
Compute time lag by Earth scale. 140. Computer reading 15 Earth minutes.
Yes, sir. Yes, if I just put a number 1 here and number 5. There is an entire comedy sequence when they land in New York in 1966 with a guy from Alabama who just cannot believe that this phone box has just appeared and that these people have just come out of it and that they do not know where they are. It is so funny. It is a barrel of laughs. And then, of course, when they leave and the Daleks show up, and then he's surprised to see the Dalek, but he's not really that fazed that it's a Dalek because that's comedy. And then the Dalek gets frustrated trying to figure out what the Alabama man's trying to say to him and leaves. And it's comedy. Then they land on a ship called the Mary Celeste, which I am sure is famous for being a ghost ship or something. Barbara is captured as a stowaway because she just had to go and have a look. Luckily, Vicky sneaks out and bonks her captor on the head, and they escape. Then the Daleks show up, and everyone is so terrified of them, they all jump off the ship to their deaths, which is kind of dark, but it's actually very comedic. So if you are ever wondering how the Mary Celeste ended up being a famous ghost ship, it was Daleks. Oh, at one point, one of the Daleks tries to follow one of the escaping ship folk and falls in the sea, and it's hilarious. Like I said, a Dalek falling down is always hilarious. I have to say, though, it is a little bit uncharacteristic of the Daleks as we know them to stop and ask for directions and to leave the people that they ask about unharmed, or like to be confused as to why people are running in terror from them, and to not actually just try and exterminate them all, or like intimidate them into staying and answering their questions. I don't know, I feel like this particular batch of Daleks were slightly undercooked. Anyway, next up is Journey into Terror, and when the TARDIS materializes in a haunted house, the TARDIS crew do what they always do, and they immediately split up and regret it later. Now, this is just basically meant to be a haunted house episode. In fact, you know what? I wonder when this episode aired. 12th of June. Okay, not quite a Halloween episode then. But yes, we're met with some very classic depictions of Count Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and a scary banshee. The TARDIS crew have to run around and try and escape the Daleks while also contending with his supernatural terrors. I did find it quite fun watching Frankenstein's monster literally lift a Dalek above his head and chuck it onto the floor. Dalek fall down, haha. I mean, the Daleks are bastards, right? It's always fun to watch them get defeated. But yes, in all of the fear and all of the confusion, they leave without Vicky, which is going to be a plot point for the next episode. Luckily, Vicky sneaks aboard the next safest time travel machine available, where she witnesses the Daleks' construction of a robot that looks just like the Doctor. Shock horror. And we see William Hartnell emerge and say things like, yes, capture and destroy, will be done. Meanwhile, on the actual TARDIS, the actual Doctor speculates that the TARDIS? What's a TARDIS? The TARDIS may have materialized inside somebody's thoughts, which is a really fun idea. But Ian says, oh, Doctor, I think there's a far more plausible explanation than that. And the camera then pans outside the haunted house to show that it was indeed a circus attraction. There we go. That's that solved then, except, hey, wait a second. Count Dracula and Frankenstein's monster and that banshee were still actual supernatural entities, so what the fuck was that about then? Like, those weren't people just dressed up as Count Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and a banshee, because first of all, the banshee was a spooky ghost lady who did spooky ghost things. Secondly, Frankenstein's monster had supernatural strength, and third, if they were just regular actors dressed up to be spooky, wouldn't they have reacted to the fucking Daleks like normal humans? I'm thinking about it too much again, aren't I? Finally, for the last 2 episodes, the TARDIS materializes on the planet Mechanus, with the aforementioned mechanoids and fungal tree creatures, and the TARDIS crew realizes that they have left Vicky behind and decide that they should capture the enemy TARDIS. It's not a TARDIS. They should capture the Dalek time machine, where they will be able to go back to those specific coordinates and pick Vicky up. Which coordinates, you may ask? Because they didn't fucking know where they were? Don't worry about it. Anyway, luckily they didn't have to do that because Vicky snuck aboard the Daleks' time machine herself. By the way, this 5th episode is called The Death of Doctor Who, which throws me of about 10 years ago into a state of absolute turmoil because I was one of those annoying people who used to run around yelling at people, he's not called Doctor Who, he's called the Doctor. You may not be surprised to hear that this was a version of myself that took the show far too seriously and therefore did not enjoy a lot of the silliness of Peter Capaldi's era. Luckily I mellowed out by the time Jodie Whittaker's era came along, where I may have stopped watching Doctor Who for good. Anyway, I like how Vicky just escapes from the Dalek time machine without issue. That's nice. Oh, by the way, remember in the Space Museum serial where Ian picked up a literal assault rifle and pretended to shoot everyone with it, going doosh, 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 and then laughing like a kid? And I was like, oh, that's really cool, Ian, well done. This time Barbara does it. This time she picks up a weapon of unknown origin and pretends to shoot everyone with it. I'm just like, I get that it's meant to be cute, you're acting like kids, but I don't know, kind of weird vibes. That very much is me applying a modern outlook to an older show, though, because I think there was less gun violence back in the day, wasn't there? Not none, don't get me wrong, but, you know, not to get too into horrible topics, but the world's changed a bit. But then this is only 20 years after World War II, so maybe I'm just making something out of nothing. Anyway, let's catch up with the Daleks and see how they're contending with this swampy, mushroom-riddled scenery terrain. That's the word.
Alert! 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 Have I sustained damage?
No, dear, you look beautiful. If you want to know what happened there, the Dalek nearly got eaten by a giant mushroom. It was funny, Dalek fall down. So at this point, the robot doctor, which looks very much like a fleshy, real doctor, is running around, which is interesting that the Daleks never attempted this again. I guess when a plan fails, they just throw it out forever. Oh god, context. Okay, at this point, the doctor and Vicky have gone to look for Ian because the doctor has found Vicky and Ian is still out looking for Vicky, but Barbara is staying behind. There we go, all caught up. The fake doctor comes and finds Barbara and tells her that Ian is dead. Barbara, of course, is an S-tier character and wants to see this with her own eyes before she believes it. I mean, okay, she's in the denial stage of grief, but I prefer to think of it as she doesn't fucking believe this maverick, this fake doctor. Anyway, the fake doctor then tries to kill Barbara. Doesn't succeed, you may be surprised to find out. If this was a Stephen Moffat story, then, you know, it probably would have started to succeed, and then there would have been a weird timey-wimey intervention, and Barbara would have been able to continue living, but she would have been this weird god entity thing. But no, Barbara's fine. Now, when you think about it, this is the first ever double doctor story, because here William Hartnell faces himself, and you might think, oh dear, this is 1965, how are they going to handle having two William Hartnells on screen? Is it going to be really obvious and embarrassing? No, except for a couple of scenes. It's actually done pretty good. However, there is one moment when William Hartnell isn't on screen, so I don't know why they didn't just use him, but they used his stand-in actor instead. And this was during a scene when you weren't really supposed to be sure which is which, so maybe it was an obvious choice, actually. Maybe they did that just to give the audience the opportunity to figure it out for themselves. But at one point, they're standing next to a character who is very clearly not William Hartnell. And William Hartnell then has to try and convince them that that is not him, that is his robot version. Anyway, they figure that out and they get rid of a robot doctor, they destroy him or whatever, and then they go to sleep, and then they wake up and they see the city of Mechanus above the fen, and that's the next episode. The final episode is called The Planet of Decision, because the planet that they are on is where they make a decision. Are you following? The TARDIS crew are running for their very lives from the Daleks, and they run into none other than the mechanoids, which are basically these giant metal balls. Before this happens, though, I would like to point out a fun little scene where Ian's talking about how the Doctor could pretend to be the fake Doctor, the robot Doctor, and throw the Daleks off. And Barbara's like, no, that's much too dangerous. And Ian's like, yeah, you're right. And he turns around and the Doctor is gone because he has heard this from Ian, and the Doctor is like, I will try anything to save my friends because he's actually a really lovable chap. And his plan immediately backfires and he has to run for his life to avoid laser fire. Anyway, then they run into the mechanoids with a very convenient elevator to take them all the way up to the city, except it turns out that they are not being saved by the mechanoids, they are being taken prisoner to be used as a display exhibit in a zoo-like thing. That's right, the TARDIS crew get taken prisoner. I know, shocking. I did like the elevator conversation scene when Vicky is trying to make conversation with the metal orb. Is it Vicky? I don't know, I didn't write that bit down. Just assume it's Vicky. You don't have to go back and watch the episode and prove me wrong, just pretend I'm right. The only thing the mechanoids say to the TARDIS crew are, enter, zero, stop. Anyway, when they get thrown in the cell, we meet Stephen Taylor, who feels like a surprisingly well-introduced character for a happenstance character in the final episode of a serial, because I quickly twigged he is the next companion. And that's interesting, by the way, because that means that both Vicky and Stephen are companions which the audience cannot relate to, because they are both from the future, or at the very least from a time and place that is not Earth and the current time that the audience is watching the show in. Anyway, apparently they're allowed up onto the roof because there's no way down. So that's handy. There also just happens to be 1,500 feet of cable up on the roof, which is also very handy. Anyway, at this point, the Daleks enter the mechanoid city, and then we get to see some fun scenes of the Daleks versus the mechanoids, and the Daleks, for this big, terrifying, existential, universal threat, which are so terrible to contend with in modern Doctor Who lore, kind of get their asses kicked by what are essentially these automated drones gone rogue. I mean, okay, I think the Daleks were pretty much going to win the fight before the Doctor's bomb went off. Remember the Doctor's bomb? The Doctor has a bomb. The Doctor's bomb went off. He set it off before they climbed up to the roof. How many Dalek stories are solved by the Doctor just deciding to bomb them? Okay, so maybe this isn't the best conclusion, but whatever, it works.
I'm exterminated! I'm exterminated!
One thing I found interesting is that Stephen almost dooms them all because he's meant to be helping to hold the rope which Vicky is currently abseiling down on, and he fucking goes, my mascot! And he fucking dives back into the fire to save his mascot, which has kept him sane, I guess, for the last 2 years, and Vicky almost falls to her death because of it. I wonder if the mascot is going to come up again in future. I did love that the mechanoids have fucking flamethrowers. What is this, Robot Wars before Robot Wars? Anyway, they escape the city of Mechanus. I know the planet's called Mechanus, but the city doesn't have a name, so I'm just calling it Mechanus as well, don't at me. The Daleks are defeated, the mechanoids are destroyed, and Stephen is apparently dead. Although I have started to watch some of the next serial, and he basically explains it away as, oh no, I did manage to jump down the rope. It was a bit on fire, but I was fine. Okay. Anyway, then we get to the sad scenes. Ian and Barbara suddenly come to the realization that they could use the Dalek's time machine to get home. When they mention this to the Doctor is absolutely furious, ostensibly because it would place them in great danger. He mentions that they have a 50-50 chance of getting there alive or just blowing up, which kind of doesn't make sense, and I think he's just making it up to try and keep them with him. Now, as I have mentioned, at this point, the Doctor is starting to shape up into the character that we recognise him to be. He is starting to be this selfless, caring man. However, at this moment, he very much kind of returns to his older ways of just absolute grumpiness, shouting at people, and generally not being a very nice person. And this, is, I think, comes from a place of insecurity because he very much doesn't want to let Ian and Barbara go. With Susan, it was kind of his decision to be like, hey, you should probably strike out on your own and kind of leave home, as it were, and become your own person, and, you know, abandons her in a post-apocalyptic society, which is kind of interesting. But with Ian and Barbara, this is solely their decision, and so that's out of his hands. And so we see them go inside the time machine, and then we see only the Doctor and Vicky come out of the time machine, and he looks very somber indeed. However, Ian and Barbara do succeed in returning home. They then also blow up the time machine inside a factory and just get away with it, which I guess is a thing that could happen in 1965, huh?
We made it!
Believe it.
London 1965!
I love that callback. That might be the first callback in all of Doctor Who, and I love it. I know that Ian saying London 1965 in that way is a meme, but I didn't realise that it was from more than one episode, because obviously in the previous Terry Nation serial, the Dalek Invasion of Earth, they arrive in what they think is London 1965, And it's not. Anyway, this is a really lovely ending for Ian and Barbara. Like, you see them go on a little montage walking around London, generally just having fun and being so excited to be home. It's actually like really wholesome and lovely to watch. Over the serials, I speculated as to whether Ian and Barbara would ever become a couple. It's never actually shown here. Ian does give Barbara a kiss on the forehead at one point, which you could say like, oh, that's a romantic gesture. I don't think it is. I think it's the gesture between two platonic friends who are going to be really close friends for life. I think they just remain friends, to be perfectly honest, and I think that's perfectly fine. But then you could also argue that there was like no depiction of romance apparently in all of Classic Who, so you could argue that it's meant to be like left up to the viewer to decide. Anyway, the ending of their story isn't about romance or not romance, it's about them being happy to be home, and again, like I said, it was really nice to see. However, I think this is also the first real heartbreaking parting from the Doctor's point of view. Like, obviously, I mentioned that Susan earlier departed the TARDIS crew, but also that was very much the Doctor's decision. And while he misses her, I think this is the first kind of like parting of the ways, I guess, that's really left a scar on him. Because in a rare moment of just, I guess, emotional honesty, the Doctor says to Vicky,
I shall miss them. Yes, I shall miss them. City of Fastbots.
And you know what? I'm with him. I'm really going to miss Ian and Barbara. Like, obviously, all character writing in this show is a product of its time at this point. But I'm really going to miss Barbara. Obviously, if you've been listening to Thoughts per episode, you know I'm a big fan of Barbara. I think she's, especially for the time she was written, in a really good character. But yeah, I'm going to miss Ian too. He was fun. There's far less male companions than there are female companions, so it's interesting whenever there is a male companion. It's interesting that there was a male companion from the very beginning. And I liked their relationship with the Doctor, the two of them. I liked their friendship with the Doctor. It was so genuine. It was so wholesome at times. And it was, it was really good times with them. And they definitely, I think, are going to go down in my brain as like companions that I enjoyed, that I'm going to miss, you know, like I'm watching classic Doctor Who after having seen so much new Who, and I always wondered, like, am I going to get the same vibes from classic Doctor Who? And I think in this sense I certainly do. It's also weirdly satisfying to be able to close a chapter in classic Doctor Who history and be like, I've seen every episode of Ian and Barbara. Well, not every episode, because of course there are some stories with missing episodes, but I've seen every like available episode, I guess. So yeah, that was The Chase, a serial with a bad name and a good everything else. Let me know what you thought, if you like, in the comments below. You don't have to, I'm not your dad, but did you like Ian and Barbara? Were they some of your favourite companions? Are there far better companions to come? And I will see you potentially next week for the next serial where we are introduced properly to Sir Stephen Taylor. Oh, and a quick note, I will be watching the Tales of a TARDIS version of that serial, because there's a Tales of a TARDIS version which usually cleans up some of the pacing and adds, you know, some things at the start and the end of the episode from like modern day perspectives of either the Doctor or his companions. In this case, I believe it's an older Vicky and Stephen reminiscing on their travels with the Doctor. So again, you might be worried like, oh, there's going to be some spoilers in the dialogue between them or whatever, but I'm okay watching it this way around, to be perfectly honest. Okay, cool. See you in the next one.